what I was thinking about and how I got involved in writing about boarding school history, and especially the book Boarding School Seasons, which was very, very important to me. So, not only am I a historian, but I'm also a descendant of Ojibwe grandparents from Minnesota who attended government boarding schools. And they were there really at the height of the assimilation movement in the early 20th century. And at the time, I was trying to have a lot of conversations with my community and my family about this very kind of complex history and period. And so that was sort of what I was up to. And if you would show the next slide, Glenaba, I'll talk about my actual origin of my interest in this topic of boarding school history. So when I was a girl, a very young girl, this photograph was hanging on my grandmother's wall in her home in Red Bee, Minnesota on the Red Lake Reservation. And I was one of those kind of nosy kids who asked a lot of questions. And my grandmother had this kind of like a collage of family photographs with kind of yellow tape. And this photograph was there with a lot of other family pictures and an old frame behind glass. And I thought it was really old-fashioned looking, and I knew it was all wrinkled and a kind of imperfect photograph. But I wondered, I remember asking my grandmother, and I should say that my grandmother was bilingual, but she did prefer to speak the Ojibwe language, even though she had gone away to boarding school for a few years. And I come from a family where my mother and her siblings, as well as our larger extended family, were kind of Ojibwe speaking people. My grandfather did not speak English at all. And so I asked my grandma, what's this? Who are these men? And what's this football team? And what's the story of this? And she said to me, um, it's probably just real simple explanation. She said, Carlisle, Jim Thorpe. And I came to learn that the person in the back row in the center was Jim Thorpe, who I probably didn't know when I was a 6 or 7 year old kid. And then she said, my dad. And I learned that the man in the back row, a few, three over from the left side, kind of looking sideways, was my great grandfather, who I didn't know. He'd passed away before I was born, but I knew that my grandmother was raised by this man, her dad, and that her mother had died when she was quite young. And so this was her family. Even though we had a larger extended family, this was a very important person in her life. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. And then when I came to learn what Carlisle was, I think in later years, I still didn't quite get what this picture was all about, because I thought, well, these aren't students. This is not boarding school. These are older men. What does this have to do with Carlisle? And what I came to figure out is that the Oorang Indian football team from the early 1920s was an all Indian football team that Jim Thorpe had organized in Ohio, in a town called Marion, Ohio. And most of the men in this photograph were people that he had known from Carlisle or even Haskell, because he had attended Haskell at one point as well. And so there is this connection to boarding school history. So I was telling Glenn about that. One of the things I've been doing in the past year is that I'm working on a younger readers edition of Boarding School Seasons for kids that are in middle school or high school kids. And so I've been going back and looking at boarding school seasons very carefully and thinking about this picture a little more, which I included in boarding school seasons, but I'm also going to include kind of like we put together what do you call it? Like a sidebar about this particular photograph. And one of the great things about kind of doing my work now is that my daughter, Benet, has graduated from the University of Minnesota with majors in Ojibwe language and art. And she's a very good writer. So she's actually my co-author in this new, and she's the one who's doing all the sidebars. So I can't tell you how great it is to have someone that I can say, go write a sidebar about something. And she shows up later and has done that. But we were thinking about this photograph again a little bit more deeply. And I realize now that this photograph of the Oorang Indian football team Thorpe organized in the early 20s in Ohio was a team that Thorpe organized because he was at that time living in Ohio. He had gone to Ohio in the early 20s to play for the Canton Bulldogs, a team. But by the time of this photograph, he was getting a little older and he wanted to be the coach and he didn't really want to play football so much anymore. And I can't blame him for that. He was, getting to be in his mid or later 30s in this picture. But the team that he organized in Ohio was the first franchise in the history of what we now call the National Football League, this team that Thorpe organized. And who would have thought that the first team in the history of the NFL was an all-Indian team organized by Jim Thorpe. And so my daughter and I are kind of writing now a book for younger readers, a kind of a book for kids in grade school that tells this interesting story of the early history of the NFL and this all-Indian team Thorpe had organized. And those of you who know about the history of the NFL, that Thorpe was actually the first director of what you would call the National Football League. And that's why the Hall of Fame, even today, is in Canton, Ohio, because that's where Jim Thorpe was living and working. And so who knew that American Indians have this kind of crazy early history of the NFL and that it's connected to boarding schools too. So I feel like I'm always learning things about boarding school history and sometimes even a picture I've seen on all my life that I kind of, it's taken me a long time to figure some things out, but I have new understandings, I guess I would say, about this period. And of course, it's not just about football, but for some Indian people, that's a very big part of the boarding school story. It was for my grandfather. And a lot of people's entree into this topic is through the really interesting sports history of this era. So I'm trying to say that boarding school is complicated, right? There are many different facets and aspects of it. And it's not just a single kind of narrative, which is something that we also tried to show, not just in those of us who have written about boarding school history, but the other thing that kind of went along with my book in time was working on an exhibit at the Heard Museum with a few of my colleagues called Remembering Our Indian School Days. That's still there. We've gone in and updated it. It opened in 2000 and we just went back and updated it a few years ago. And now we're talking about doing that again. If there's an NEH in the future and we can get grants to do these kinds of things, we're hoping to update it once again. I want to point out something that people have been asking me a lot about in the last couple of years, and that has to do with the stories of Indian deaths in boarding school, and especially after the stories came out in Canada about the children at residential schools and the story of unmarked graves and this kind of thing. So when I was working on boarding school seasons years ago, I wanted to understand about the broad range of experience. There might have been people like Thorpe and these guys in the picture who had a great time at Carlisle and went on to play football. And then there were other people who didn't survive boarding school because this coincided also with a period that was very dark for a lot of American Indians in relationship to poor health, the rise of disease. And now we know a little bit more about pandemics. And the boarding school, the first time I ever heard of a global pandemic was when I was in the archives doing research on boarding schools, because I learned that a lot of kids grew very sick and some of them died during the big influenza pandemic of 1918, 1920. So that's part of our history as well. Maybe I'll mention one more thing, go on to the next photograph before I lose my train of thought on football, Glenaba, after this one. There's one more picture I kind of wanted to show you. Yeah, so a few years ago, I was cleaning in my mother's house, and I was throwing out a lot of stuff at the time. And you know how that task can be of going through family belongings and so forth. And I came across this picture, which was a picture I'd never seen before. And it was like in a little white envelope, and I almost tossed it out, but I was happy that I didn't, because this is another photograph from that era that must have belonged to my great grandfather. And it shows again Jim Thorpe with members of this football team. So you never know, you got to be careful sometimes in going through belongings, because this is a kind of the football team of the whole team is kind of a well-known photograph, but this is different. This one is just kind of a family photograph that my great grandfather must have saved from that era. I don't know what's next, but go ahead and put up the next slide too. Yeah, so the thing about, thinking about pandemics, which, has been interesting to me because of our recent experience, is also, thinking about the high numbers of Indian people who died during the global pandemic a century ago. And some of you know about the famous dance order that came out of the Indian office in 1921. I know that Glenaba probably knows about how the Pueblo leaders from northern New Mexico had a very strong response to this directive that came out of the Indian office in 1921 and said, "What do you mean you expect us not to take part in dances anymore? This is not just our culture, but that they said, this is our art. This is our, so special to us. It's like your opera, it's like your museums, And so they had a very strong response to it. But here in Minnesota, where I live, Ojibwe women also had a very strong response to the dance order of 1921, which is when they created a new healing tradition that's still with us a century later, called the jingle dress dance, created in the aftermath of the global pandemic because of the losses to their communities. So I say this because there's a lot of interesting social history of this era. We think of it as the boarding school era, but of course it's an era also of, pandemic. It's an era of forced assimilation, which is, I often think about the dance order as being kind of the last gasp of assimilation, trying to outlaw powwows and this kind of thing in Indian country. But what I like about sort of studying this era and the people who lived at this time is that they were very, what would I say? They weren't going to go along with they were very resistant. They were not going to go along with what the government told them to do. And I think of this amazing photograph. This one's from, I think, Walker, Minnesota, in northern Minnesota, not that far from the Leech Lake Reservation. And it shows at the time the dance order is telling Indian people they can't have powwows and ritualistic dance on their reservations. Ojibwe women are creating this whole new healing tradition, and they're out there practicing, but they're also doing it. Do you see this gigantic American flag? They're also doing it under the gigantic American flag because they knew that these sorts of symbols appeased people who were putting out things like the dance order. So I often think this generation had to be very savvy about not just establishing who they were, but how they dealt with the federal government. They had to be very strategic. And they said, yeah, we're going to go out and we're going to have a powwow, but we're going to put out the American flag. This is really a tribute to the United States, what we're doing now. And so during these years, when Native people's lives were being suppressed and during the boarding school era, these are some of the creative responses that American Indian people had to resist that time. And we should never forget that resistance because it's why we're still here today. It's why we're still here today. So anyway, this is the kind of thing that's taking place at the time. And I would also say that for Ojibwe people like those of us here in the Great Lakes, this is also not just the boarding school era, but this is the big era of dispossession. And that's the point that I also want to make too, that when we think of the boarding school era, and I'm a historian, so I tend to take the chronology of things very seriously. I usually date the boarding school era from the time of the establishment of the Carlisle School in 1879. And soon after, in that next decade, the government passes the General Allotment Act. And here in Minnesota, where I live, we even had special legislation to deal with allotment called the Nelson Act. And this was a time of a lot of land passing out of Indian ownership. So for the next 50 years after the first government boarding school, and I realized that students went to Hampton before Carlisle, I realized that there were various religious denominations that also recruited Indian people. But I usually do date, the beginning of the boarding school era with the establishment of Carlisle in 1879. But we know that in the aftermath of the General Allotment Act, that for that next 50 years, there was a tremendous, massive dispossession that took place when the Allotment Act was amended in various ways. And here, where I'm from in the Great Lakes, this was an era of tremendous, tremendous dispossession. But it's also part of a national story. And so, I was thinking in writing that book for younger readers, what's the one takeaway that I want young people to have if they're thinking about the history of government boarding schools? And what I always end up saying is something like this, that boarding schools were not really about educating Indians. There was a lot of rhetoric about civilizing, assimilating, and educating Indians. But boarding schools were established to dispossess Indians of their land, that Native people were, being educated so that they wouldn't really need to return home anymore. And the government was doing their best to kind of break up the tribal land base at the time. So following the treaty era, when Native people lost a lot of land, tribal people were still in possession of quite a bit of real estate here in the Great Lakes and in regions farther west. But here comes the Allotment Act, which coincides with the boarding school era. And for the next 50 years, up until FDR, a massive land grab took place of over 90 million acres of Indian land passing out of Indian ownership and into the hands of the
Yeah,
federal government.
I don't think there's none here today, but I don't know. I don't really come here that often. I know.
Thanks. And so this massive land grab was taking place, and this coincided with the boarding school era. And if you think about it, I think it was maybe Vine Deloria who at one point made the point that that there were that this is the largest dispossession in the history of the world. Not just in the history of this country, but it was one of the largest dispossessions in world history. And that's what I can't help but think and go back to again and again is that you have to kind of look behind the rhetoric of the assimilation era. We want Indians to be citizens. We want them to speak English. We want them to have jobs. We want them to enter American society. All of these things that assimilationists were saying, and at the same time saying there was something wrong with Indian people, that they had to make a transformation culturally in order to become American citizens. But with that, the big picture is the big land dispossession that accompanied the boarding school era. So, humanitarian language about assimilating Indian people ran very deep in Washington, D.C. And yet, boarding schools were motivated by greed, right? That it's about dispossession. Politicians at the time claimed that tribal life was obsolete and that our ancestors needed new values, individualism, and they needed to become citizens of the United States. And so young people who went to government boarding schools were trained as agricultural or industrial workers as their lands, as their homelands were being carved up and sold. And so I think we should never forget that rhetoric of the boarding school era and what people were trying to sell about Native people at the time. And we have to look behind the motivations of this rhetoric, like, for the idea that kids in government boarding schools are going to learn to be farmers and live like white Americans. Like, to me, I just been reading this fall, one of my favorite books I've read is Angela Parker's new book, who is from Fort Berthold. She's a professor, a historian at the University of Denver, but she's just written this fabulous new book about the history of her community, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara in North Dakota. And she talks about what happened to her tribe when the Missouri Dam, the Garrison Dam was created, and their lands, their agricultural lands in North Dakota were flooded so that they could no longer be farmers like their ancestors. And so when you read works like that, you read, my gosh, the best farmers in the history of this country were not European settlers. They were Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara women, or they were the farmers in the Southwest, or the Iroquois peoples in the Northeast. So there was like a mass kind of, I don't know what you'd say, people had to act like they were very ignorant of indigenous agricultural practices to say that Indian people needed to learn a new way of life and be re-educated in government boarding schools. My grandmother was the first person actually to tell me about the outing program that Carlisle and other of the boarding schools followed, because she had to go out like girls commonly did in government boarding schools and work as a domestic servant for a local white household. And I read a lot of, especially from Haskell, the records of the very rebellious girls who worked on the outing program, which was always something that I enjoyed reading about their story very much. But you also have to remember that this was the big era of for everybody. There was a lot of baby laundry, shall we say, and that people, and it was middle-class women wanted Indian girls. They wanted domestic servants to help them out in their households. And this is what a lot of outing school girls did, is work for white families with young children during that time. Of course, boarding schools were also an English-only environment. I don't need to tell this group of people that boarding schools were damaging to language, to cultural institutions. And the other kind of thing to kind of come to terms with, I think, about this era is that narratives of boarding school life also include some children who found, I don't know what you want to call it, refuge, perhaps, in government boarding schools. And that's sometimes difficult to understand. But let me see, Glenna, I think there's one family letter, go through the sports pictures and yeah. So this letter I just read to the audience last night because I was over in Wisconsin.
Find out if students are coming.
Oh, okay.
And that that letter, yeah, you had the right one up there of the kids. Yes. And I just read this to my audience last night when I was speaking in Wisconsin, because I think it was from the Lakota Ray Reservation in Wisconsin, and a man who wrote to Flandreau about his children in 1923. And he says, I've lost my wife and left me with 6 children. When I'm going working out, it's hard for them. And this is all I ask you, if you have a place for them. One of the things that I spent a lot of time trying to understand was why families themselves would sometimes turn to boarding schools for their children, why they were sending in applications to have their children enrolled. And the reality is that these were very tough times for Indian families. And if you would ask me, what is the single number one reason why kids enrolled in government boarding schools, I would say death of a mother. There were lots of families. And again, this big year of tuberculosis, when the networks that Indigenous people had relied on for generations were kind of failing people because someone had died of tuberculosis, other relatives were in TB sanitariums, and there was a lot of widespread poverty. As here, like where I'm sitting in the Great Lakes, our traditional economies were being undermined through dispossession. And so there's a whole set of circumstances that led to a kind of new poverty that Indian people were experiencing during the boarding school era. And I think when you look at this letter from 1923, it's not hard to figure out, right? You don't need a PhD to see this father is describing a difficult circumstance. He's got 6 kids and he's trying to find a place for them. Well, they will have meals and clothing and shoes and be able to go to school. And this is what you increasingly see as Native people are becoming dispossessed during the boarding school era. And it's somewhat ironic that the boarding schools, just as the federal government wants to close them down under FDR, right? And John Collier is the new commissioner of Indian Affairs under Roosevelt. And he and other progressive reformers at the time are calling boarding schools medieval institutions. The federal government itself had turned away from the boarding school concept. And yet, the boarding school era of highest enrollment is the 1930s. So the federal government is closing them down. And at the same time, Indian people are experiencing a newfound poverty through the collapse of their traditional economies because of their dispossession of the previous half century. And they too become unemployed during the Great Depression. And so survival sometimes means that Indian families in the 1930s are turning to government boarding schools as a form of poverty relief for their families during the Great Depression. So it's kind of funny how the boarding school era turns out, after 50 years of 50 years after Carlisle is established, because impoverishment and dispossession is complete. It's no longer necessary to keep Indians in government boarding schools in the 1930s. So the federal government is closing them down, just as Indian people are kind of turning to them as familiar institutions that they could resort to when they are beset with problems, as Indian people increasingly were. So by the 1930s, the United States had accomplished what it set out to do at the beginning of the assimilation era, to control reservation properties and turn them over to white landowners. Government boarding schools are part of this story of dispossession. And so, really it's interesting to think about then how the Indian office in Washington is now advocating public school education for Indian people by the mid 1930s. In fact, if I had another lifetime to live, I would study more about the public school integration of American Indian people, because after the 1930s, that's the big story of Indian education in the United States. Um, and also, just to kind of wrap this up and to try to say something about a little bit about the differences with Canada then and why people, often say, you have this history of residential school, but we have this corresponding history of boarding schools in the United States. It's important to keep in mind that in Canada, where they didn't develop this kind of federal apparatus for Indian education like we did that kept the 25 government boarding schools in the Western states operational up until the 1930s. They kind of farmed out Indian education in Canada to the religious organizations. And so the Episcopal or the Anglican Church in Canada, the Catholic Church, and another Protestant denomination were largely in charge of Indian education in Canada. But in the US, the federal government had this system of Indian education in federal schools that they controlled and operated and sent out the teachers and that sort of thing. So that was a little bit different from how things went in Canada. But also, what I'm suggesting to you is that the federal government in the United States turned to um, turned to turned to public schools under FDR. And that didn't happen in the same way in Canada. So the residential schools kind of continued for another half century in Canada. So that, the people, I know a lot of Ojibwe people of my generation who live across the border or grew up across the border in Canada, and many of them went to residential schools themselves. And here in the United States, you know that today I've been talking about my grandmother's generation or my great grandfather who went to Carlisle, that this was kind of my mother and her siblings on the Red Lake Reservation went to day schools on the reservation after, in the years before and after World War II. And so in the United States, public schools come to dominate the story of Indian education after FDR. That's not to say, and you always have to add a footnote to this story. Of course, there were some schools that continued after World War II and after the Great Depression, and that had to do with sometimes like the Phoenix Indian School, the Santa Fe Indian School, the stories where Native people who lived in kind of rural areas, that it still made sense for them to, consolidate kids because they lived in these small communities in rural areas of the country. And so while there were some schools that continued after what I tend to think of as the boarding school story, they're not the kind of era that I tend to think of as lasting from Carlisle up through, essentially FDR. So that's how I look at things, kind of as a historian.